Doug runs an organization that a lot of you know about, Livestrong. And what you probably know about Livestrong is the yellow bracelet that you see. It's ubiquitous. I think it's like 80 million sold or something. It's all over the place. But what a lot of people don't realize is all the other things that Livestrong does. And we've written about it in the magazine. And I think it'll be really interesting to find out. It's everything from like working behind the scenes to help make a session of the UN that just happened in September possible, where they're really trying to get countries around the world to increase their investments in cancer research. It's operating a walk-in center for cancer patients in Austin. It's operating a call center that answers questions from people who are newly diagnosed, really trying to help them navigate the practical reality of being diagnosed with this disease. And it's just taking a more creative approach to the disease than some other organizations, frankly, have done. And especially coming out of a foundation started by an athlete, which traditionally we see a lot of them have a very narrow focus. A lot of them are just not run well. They're started with great intentions. And so what I'm interested in hearing about from you, Doug, is how you guys have transcended that. And so start out with just this question of how did Livestrong expand from being focused on a single cancer, Lance Armstrong's cancer, to the gamut of cancer?
Sure. So, you know, Lance was obviously a 26-year-old kid in Texas who was diagnosed with a cancer that at the time most people weren't talking about, testicular cancer. And one of his doctors said to him on his last day of treatment, he said, "You can, metaphorically speaking, leave this hospital through one of two doors. You can go out one side and never talk about this and sort of go back to your life and forget that this ever happened, or you can go out the other door and you can take on what's called the obligation of the cured. And that obligation is to share your story with the hope that it might help somebody else one day." Mm-hmm. And at the time, I don't think he had any idea what this would become, but he said, you know what, we can help some people. Let's put together a bike ride. Let's raise some money. And it started as an organization that was raising money for cancer research. But soon after, they realized that for as long as he lived and as long as many millions of other cancer survivors lived, they would deal with the same issues. Mm-hmm. They would deal with the practical, the emotional, the financial, and psychosocial issues that came with this diagnosis. And so the organization early on started sharing stories and getting other people to share stories. And you know, you mentioned this thing about sort of athlete foundations. I mean, I've got to tell you the story. I was sitting on an airplane about 2 years ago, and the woman next to me was asking me what I was doing, and we were talking, and at one point she said to me, she says, "So have you ever met Lance Armstrong?" And it sort of hit me as, wow, that's a strange question. But then I stepped back and I realized that's the sort of prevailing thinking, which is, oh, they can't be involved. Right. I mean, there's no way that he actually is involved.
They put their name on it and then they walk away and that's it.
And I think that's one of the big differentiating factors. I mean, as you and I have talked over the years, I mean, Lance and I talk twice, 3 times a day. You know, sometimes we talk in the morning and he says, "What's new?" And I say, "Well, from the time we talked last night before we went to bed, not a whole lot," you know. But he's very engaged, he's very involved, and that's a good thing. Mm-hmm.
And one aspect to your story is the fact that it's not only Lance Armstrong's experience, that's what brought him to this, but you guys actually had like parallel lives. You were diagnosed early and you started a foundation. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I was 19 and I was an athlete, and I realized very quickly that as wonderful a family as I had and insurance and resources, I realized that I knew nothing about cancer. Never remember learning about it in high school, never remember sort of talking about it. And I realized that, again, as great of a support network as I had, there was something missing, which was how do you connect to other people who've been down that same road and hear about their experience and provide that dialogue. And so we started a foundation focused on young adults with cancer. In fact, I remember calling a national organization when I was diagnosed and looking for support, and they said, "Oh, people your age don't get cancer." And I thought, really? And so I knew there was a need. I didn't know what the need was, and that's actually, you know, been 14 and a half years ago.
Right. You know, you talk about these other organizations that actually work in the cancer world. I'm wondering how they perceived you guys as you guys started to expand your mission, and they're like, "Hey, wait a second, we're on this. We're on the case. stay with that testicular cancer focus. That's awesome. Yeah. How did you kind of, get into the conversation with these larger organizations, more established?
It's been interesting. We're based in Austin, Texas. We have made the sort of philosophical decision to have everybody based in Austin and not set up a ton of infrastructure and affiliates and chapters and sort of go the traditional growth route, which has been good because if we had done that, that would have infringed on other people's territory, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The irony is that we don't see anybody in the space as competitors. We see them as partners. But the reality is when other organizations in the cancer community do strategic planning, we are most often listed on the competition page.
For fundraising dollars.
And it's for fundraising.
Yeah, right.
And the beauty of our organization, in my opinion, is that most of our board members are entrepreneurs, mm-hmm. and they're very successful, either entrepreneurs or venture capitalists, and they never put the stress on fundraising. They never say, oh, we have to raise X number of dollars. They always say, you tell us what you're trying to accomplish, mm-hmm. and we'll figure out a way to get the resources. Hmm. And I think many organizations that grow in size and scope end up doing the reverse. They end up saying, wait a minute, we have to raise X to just keep this machine going, and they don't start the planning process with, what are we trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. And I think that gets some people in trouble.
Yeah. I'm curious about the changing the name of the organization.
Sure.
It made that leap from, again, a lot of these athlete foundations start with, you got to have the name of the athlete in there, that is the draw. And initially it was the Lance Armstrong Foundation, and then at some point it became what we know in the yellow band, it became Livestrong.
Yeah. Well, so the evolution of Livestrong is interesting. Livestrong was originally the name of a program that we created for cancer survivors, and we couldn't come up with a name for this program, and so we hired this creative firm in Austin called Milkshake Media, and we said, go do focus groups with cancer survivors and figure out a name for this program. And they came back with 10 names. They were all terrible. And we said, go back. In fact, they did focus groups here in Chicago, Denver, Chicago, and Austin. And they came back and they brought 5 new names. And at the time, this was 2003, the organization had 9 employees. And they put these 5 boards out on the table, and one of them was Livestrong. And the logo was gray and orange, and it had this big L and this S, and it had nothing to do with Lance's name. Everybody thinks it's a play on his name. That didn't come up once in the transcripts of these focus groups. And so we picked this Livestrong as the name, and then a year or 2 later, Nike came to us and wanted to do a wristband, and they actually wanted to put Just Do It on the wristband. Mm-hmm. And we thought, that's a little too corporate, and then we talked about Livestrong, and they were like, that's it, let's put Livestrong on there. And so the name just evolved over time, and we started getting letters and emails and calls from people, and they would address them to Livestrong. Mm-hmm. Dear Livestrong, is this Livestrong on the phone? And so it was just a natural sort of shift. But the other thing we did years ago before that is we studied many other organizations that were started by visible figures. And we studied athletes, celebrities, other organizations, and what we found was very few of them had longevity, mm-hmm. because the individual who started it either became less visible or the individual who started it passed away from a disease. And the best example was that we found was a great organization that we modeled a lot of programs after, which was the Chris and Dana Reeve Foundation. Mm-hmm. Phenomenal work in the spinal cord injury field, and yet after Chris and Dana's passing, it has had trouble growing. Mm-hmm. And so Lance was the first one to say, hey, I don't need or want my name on the door forever.
That's what I was curious about, was how did he feel when all of a sudden something that was very close to him took on a whole separate identity and
when I joined
a necessary leap?
When I joined the organization in 2001, we had 3 employees, and one of my biggest frustrations was seeing Lance do interviews, and he would never mention the foundation. And it took so long to figure out why. And it was because he felt very awkward mentioning his own name. He felt awkward talking about his foundation. Right. And now, when he's on TV or doing interviews, he's always talking about Livestrong. It's like it's this other thing, and it made him much more comfortable. And so that's been a really great byproduct of that mm-hmm. process.
So, with Lance, I mean, you have this advantage in the organization that these other cancer organizations sure. don't, and you guys really take advantage of that well. Talk about the pros and cons. I mean, on the one hand, you have the best known, most admired cancer survivor out there.
Sure.
On the other hand, you have a guy who shows up in the news, and because of his sport and because of all the allegations and all the questions and the federal investigation, it could potentially hurt exactly what you're trying to do. How do you take advantage, exploit one, and not get hurt by the other?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other things that came up during these focus groups when Livestrong was created was this huge tension, because some of the survivors in the focus group said, this is great. This is what I aspire to do. I want to live strong. I love that brand. And others in the group.
They tattooed themselves.
Yeah, oh, people had
Livestrong.
tattoos put on. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's brand affinity
Yeah,
right there.
right.
But the other part of the focus group, people said, how dare you tell me how to live? Don't project on me your values or what you think I should do post-cancer. And we had a board member at the time, we were reviewing the options, who said, you know what, that's what you want. You want that tension. You want that sort of dialogue. And I think, you know, Lance has done something, you know, obviously I'm biased, but has done something that no other athlete has ever done, which is start an organization that's created a movement while they're in their prime. A lot of people do it after the fact, and the results are diminished because of their visibility diminishing. But the tension that he brings has, for us, been, I think, a huge positive. It's brought tremendous attention. And the reality is that given all of that, the totality of who he is as an individual, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't see personally sort of the inspiration that he brings to the cause. And the other reality is that today, as an example, I mean, we will serve thousands of people who have just heard some of the scariest words they'll ever hear. You have cancer. And, you know, to them, it's all about, did this organization serve me at a time when I was in need? And that's what we have to stay focused on.
Right. So talk about this UN initiative. To me, this is an example of how, and it traces back to this plane trip that you took, that you and Lance took with Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
Give us kind of the genesis of this, because it seemed to be planned pretty long term, and it built up to just what happened last month.
Yeah, you know, it was about 5 years ago that we were fortunate enough to be on an airplane with Bill Clinton and traveling around Canada, and he said, what's the biggest challenge that you face? And we said, you know, the biggest challenge is that cancer has always been seen as a scientific problem. We're going to give money, we're going to participate in events, and somewhere, someone is going to solve this problem for us. And the reality is that 50% of all deaths from cancer could be eliminated today with what we already know works, either prevention or applying the treatments that are already available.
Right.
And so what we said to President Clinton was, that's the issue. How do we reshape this dialogue from being a scientific problem to something that we can all participate in the solution for? And he said, well, Doug, this is the same problem we had years ago with HIV/AIDS. People in the United States were surviving, people in Africa were dying, and that's a moral and ethical failure, and we need to address it. And so that's when this process started of saying, okay, the United Nations from a policy perspective needs to get this on the public health agenda around the world. And it just took place a few weeks ago, and it was the second time ever that the United Nations had met to talk about a health-related topic. And the reality is we can create all the best direct service programs in the world, and other organizations can as well, but if you don't have policy change sort of in concert with that, you're never going to sort of solve the problem. And so, you know, 70% of all new cancer cases are in the developing world. You know, there's a lot of facts out there that aren't well known, and so hopefully with the UN raising the profile, we'll see some of that change.
Well, and you guys were, this is what really got my attention, you guys were working behind the scenes in a way that I don't think anybody was aware. Having these meetings, pulling together the stakeholders, talk about a meeting, maybe it was the Global Summit, where, and Livestrong does a global summit that's similar to the Clinton Global Global Initiative, where you were able to pull them together in a way that they hadn't come together before.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things, again, because we haven't been focused on fundraising, it allows us a little bit more flexibility to be behind the scenes and not worry about who gets credit, and just figure out, okay, what do we need to happen? Well, we need the United Nations to make cancer a global priority, period. Okay, let's work backwards. How do we make that happen? Okay, we bring stakeholders together in Dublin, Ireland. We have meetings at WHO. We actually hire a design and creative firm to go to WHO and help them with their messaging, because their messaging was terrible and no one was paying attention when they talked about non-communicable disease and, you know, all these things. Right. And so, you know, we spent $200,000–300,000 to help shape that message that then results in 40 heads of state standing up in New York and making major commitments. And so the best thing that was very flattering and really touched us deeply was that at CGI this year, President Clinton stood up on stage and said, I want to thank the Lance Armstrong Foundation and Livestrong for opening my eyes to the problem of non-communicable disease around the world. And so that's 5 years from the plane trip to CGI, and a lot has happened, and a lot of partners were involved. But for us, if we can stay focused on trying to have an impact and not worry about who gets credit, it's worth it.
Well, and that seems like the best way back to circle back to the question I asked earlier about how do you get these other organizations, to help you be involved. You're helping them. You're helping the WHO actually do their jobs better and everything. So that just you get the buy-in.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to open it up to other questions because I'm imagining you guys are going to have some good questions here. I think we've got one over here. Oh, sorry, I misinterpreted. I'm gonna ask a quick question while we're waiting, which is one of the other parts of Livestrong that again is just really unusual for an organization is the Livestrong.com, which is separate from Livestrong.org. It's not part of the nonprofit. Talk about, I guess, the risks and the advantages of expanding the brand to a .com like that.
Sure. So we are very fortunate to have this brand. And it's a powerful one and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And one of the things it allows us to do is partner with for-profit companies like Nike and Oakley and others to generate both awareness but also revenue for the organization, so we don't have to raise money necessarily in the traditional manner. So the partnership with Livestrong.com was this idea that we are focused solely on helping people with cancer. And yet we knew the brand meant something so much bigger: health, wellness, prevention, nutrition, exercise. And so we partnered with them to create a property that was focused on those things. And the goal was, can they drive traffic and attention to the foundation? And Livestrong.com just passed WebMD as the #1 trafficked health site on the web in less than 2 years.
Wow.
And so it's having that effect. So 8 million or 9 million people a month are now getting access to the brand, which will ultimately lead to more advocacy, more people getting involved in the cause. And so it's not been perfect, but it has worked.
Okay. Great. Actually, don't think we have time for questions. So we do have a question back up here. Sorry. Yes.
Doug, I could pick your brain for hours. I actually started a non-for-profit with my best friend 6 years ago. And we've raised just over $250,000, which obviously is
That's awesome.
Nothing compared to the Livestrong Foundation. But
it's amazing, though.
We've traveled to Milan, run marathons. It's also an athletic thing. And just 2 years ago, we had some brands coming to us wanting to partner up. And my best friend, who's living with cystic fibrosis, has a problem with it. And for myself, I can relate to you as far as you talking about Lance not bringing up the foundation when he speaks. My friend's the same way. How would you go about, or what would be your advice going about partnering up with the right allies? Because obviously, in the end, it's about curing this disease, whether cancer or cystic fibrosis.
It's a great question, and something that we deal with every day. The partner has to be mission-focused. I mean, you have to have 100% confidence that they are in it for the right reason and that they want to see you fulfill and pursue your goals. We've had tons of organizations that we've turned down, and two in particular that I remember that were both multi-year, multi-million-dollar partnerships. One was in the insurance industry, and we just said, look, we can't do that. I mean, we can't do that because every day people are calling us saying, my insurance company denied my bone marrow transplant, or I have a pre-existing condition, or how could we on the one hand take money from that industry and then try to serve individuals on the other side? So, and the other was a company that was in the sort of nutrition space, but we didn't think the products lived up to our brand. And so tough decisions because you're turning down huge corporate sort of resources and marketing and financial support. But I think it just has to be the right fit. And so far we've been fortunate to have great partners.
We do have time for questions. I'm going to sneak one in here real quick. You guys were given the advantage of being able to kind of see what life was like without Lance, being on, in high profile and everything, doing the Tour de France when he retired, and then he unretired. What did you learn from when he was retired about his role and about how that was going to affect the organization that is helping you now that he retired for good, as far as I know?
He re-retired. I think it was totally counterintuitive, but most people, and I had friends who would call me and they say, what are you going to do now? The guy's retired.
Right.
you know? I'm like, well, he's 35 years old. He's never going to be retired. And the fact was that he had so much more time. So he had time to travel around with President Clinton, and he had time to spend with Mayor Bloomberg, and you know, he loves being around
the presidential council
cancer panel,
yeah,
and it gave him time that he never had when he was racing.
Right.
And it actually opened up tons of relationships and tons of doors that we're now sort of leveraging. So I see the same thing happening now. He was living in Europe for 6 months a year and just was not as accessible as he is now. And so it's been phenomenal to have his time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. Any questions out there for Doug?
I must say, just so I can embarrass Chuck, and I met 14 and a half years ago.
It's true.
And Chuck wrote a story about me at that time and the Ulman Cancer Fund for Young Adults, which we had started, which is the actual article that Lance read and then emailed me from. So was it not for Chuck, I probably wouldn't have this dream job that I love. So right, we go way back.
We do. That's very nice of you to say. I have to say, I remember I met, he was 20 years old, and I went home and I remember telling my wife, I was like, I met one of those people that you know is going to lead something. He's 20 and he started a foundation and he's talking about how to put cancer warnings about skin cancer like in tennis shoes. So he's trying to contact a shoe manufacturer. Wow, he's going to run something. Someday he's going to be in charge of something. And so it was really gratifying, but not surprising when you connected with Lance and you wound up ultimately running the organization. So it's been fascinating to see the journey, trajectory.
Likewise,
yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
I have a question.
Yeah.
A huge part of cancer survival is about conversation, and you mentioned that conversation is a big part of your planning. With the internet being so big and social media being really big, there's a lot of conversation that's out there already. How has your organization changed with these big changes with the internet, people
Sure.
not being alone, feeling that they're alone anymore, and people sharing their stories online, whether it's on blogs, forums, or Twitter, whatever it is?
Sure. It's been huge for us. It's changed our business. I always say two things about this yellow wristband. One, that it democratized philanthropy because it was $1 and everybody could participate. And two, that it was really the first form of social media. And the reason I say that is because it created conversations. People all over would go up and talk to strangers because they had one on. What's your story? Why do you wear that? You know, who in your family has been impacted by the disease? And so when Facebook and Twitter and everything else came along, we sort of transitioned that conversation. So it still happens in person, but that community is now online. And so for our organization, the biggest referrals in terms of survivors looking for support and community come to us through Facebook. And the second is through Twitter. And so, you know, we have a full staff of people that's all they do, and they're engaging with newly diagnosed individuals and families and survivors sort of in real time. And it allows people to get information so much quicker than in the past, and it creates this vibrant community. So, and for nonprofit, it's free. So the tools have been just phenomenal. And I was not a believer because I didn't have Facebook, didn't have any of that stuff, but I've been converted.
Converted. He now has like 1 million people following him on Twitter. So
scary.
Yeah, it is. All right, great. Well, like I said, it's been amazing to watch the trajectory, and I'm really glad we're able to share it with everybody here. Doug's story. So thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Right. That's awesome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.